Good afternoon. My name is Ben Pansera, and I'm the director of the Bibliotech Center for Special Collections and Archives here at Connecticut College. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you all here for the annual Sound Lab Foundation Lecture. Tonight's lecture is the 20th in an annual series co-sponsored by the Sound Lab Foundation and the Friends of the Connecticut College Library. The Sound Lab, also known as the Naval Underseas Warfare Center, was established in New London during the Second World War to support technological research in the development of submarines. During its heyday, the Sound Lab employed about 3,000 people in southeastern Connecticut, and until its operations were moved to Newport, Rhode Island. For nearly 50 years, the scientists and the engineers of the Sound Lab played a vital role in the scientific, intellectual, and cultural life of this region. The idea of the foundation grew out of a discussion at the 1994 reunion of retired employees who wanted to keep the memory of the Sound Lab alive in the region. In 1997, 1 year after the Sound Lab closed its doors in New London, employees, retirees, and friends pooled their resources and made a gift to the college to establish an endowment for the lecture. And there are in fact a number of retirees from the Sound Lab here, many of whom did contribute to that endowment. I could ask actually if Sound Lab retirees could raise their hands and acknowledge them, please. The first lecture was held in the fall of 1998, and the series has continued to draw faculty, students, and local residents every year to Connecticut College, becoming an important town-gown partnership that brings national speakers on politics, culture, and science and technology to New London, or in this case, back to New London. I would like to thank the Lecture Planning Committee, Mary Ellen Hanrahan, Jan Lindberg, Rosemary Haubrigg, and Joy Merrill for putting this event together. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Becky Palmer and Rose Oliveira, for doing a lot of the last-minute work to set this up. And to introduce tonight's speaker, please welcome Connecticut College President, Catherine Bergeron.
Good afternoon, everyone. I, too, am pleased to welcome all of you to Connecticut College for this very special event this afternoon. This afternoon, we're going to be hearing from a distinguished alumnus of this college, someone who has built a notable career confronting power, uncovering truth, and ensuring that citizens are equipped with the knowledge they need to engage meaningfully in a democratic society. Joshua Green, from the Connecticut College class of 1994, is arguably one of the most influential long-form political journalists in America today, a writer who has profiled some notable figures in American politics, from Hillary Clinton to Karl Rove to Sarah Palin. In an era of speed writing, Josh is known for taking his time. He not only digs deep to find the heart of a story, but he also takes a real interest in people. And his thoughtful and fair-minded approach to his subjects has given him unusual access and insight. I'd like to think that he learned that work ethic right here at Connecticut College. Josh was not just a student here, but also the son of Garrett Green, a beloved professor and chair of religious studies who served on the faculty for 36 years. Mr. and Mrs. Green are here this afternoon, and I do think we ought to recognize them for their part in imbuing Josh with the good values that's so evident in his work. Will you stand? Now, like many young people who can be slow to recognize a good thing, Josh, I have to tell you this, actually began his college career at Trinity in Hartford. Fortunately for us, he came to his senses and realized that the best education was literally right here in his own backyard. So he did return to Connecticut College to complete a double major in English and economics, a foundation that would serve him well in his future work. His journalistic career began at the infamous news satire organization called The Onion. After getting his fill of parody, he tried his hand as a sports writer and then as a music critic, and he saw that journalism was really the right path for him. So he enrolled in Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, where he earned a master's and got his first taste of political reporting, and the rest, as they say, is history. In the early 2000s, he became a staff writer for the American Prospect and the Washington Monthly before beginning an 8-year tenure with The Atlantic, where his exposés of Hillary Clinton and George W. Bush made him a household name. He has produced a weekly political column for the Boston Globe and has written stories for the New Yorker, Slate, Esquire, Rolling Stone, and many other publications. He's currently a senior national correspondent for Bloomberg Business Week, and he can be seen regularly on MSNBC's Morning Joe, NBC's Meet the Press, HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, and PBS's Washington Week. And if you somehow missed these, you've probably caught him more recently on TV or radio talking about his new book, Devil's Bargain, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storming of the Presidency. The most recent issue of the CC magazine has a great feature that talks about this book and Josh's perspicacity in recognizing what Bannon was trying to do in consolidating an alternative right-wing coalition in the United States. The book debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and has already been optioned by Academy Award-winning producer Jason Blum for a movie or TV series. And we were just discussing the fact that Jason Blum has made his career as a horror movie producer. And so it's interesting to think how this is going to turn out. I really can think of no one who embodies Connecticut College's mission of putting the liberal arts into action than this leading voice of American politics. Please join me in welcoming Joshua Green.
Thanks so much, everybody. Last time I was here speaking on Con, I think it was about 9 or 10 years ago, in a classroom in Blasty, and it's probably about 30 or 40 people, which seemed like a lot. So this is quite a turnout. If my fellow Con alum Sean Spicer were here, who's a year ahead of me at Con, who actually remember, I'm sure he would declare this the largest lecture crowd in the history of Connecticut College. So aren't you all lucky for being a part of it? On a more serious note, thank you so much for having me back. Thanks to Ben Pansiera, thanks to President Bergeron. It's a real treat and an honor to be back at such an interesting time in our country's politics. As President Bergeron mentioned, I wrote a book on Steve Bannon and Donald Trump in the election. I talked about that a little bit today. I was going to try and broaden out a little bit, just so I don't bore people who have read the book, and talk more generally about the rise of Donald Trump, of nationalism in American politics, and about where this all might head next. And over the last couple of months, as I've gone out speaking about the book, I have discovered that audiences often have many things they want to ask me about Steve Bannon and Donald Trump. And so I thought what I would do is talk for about 20 or 25 minutes so that we have plenty of time for questions from the audience, should you have anything you'd like to ask me. So let me begin by talking about when I first encountered the idea of nationalism in U.S. politics. It was in 2011, where I had just met a filmmaker who I had never heard of named Steve Bannon. I had recently returned from Alaska, where I'd done a big profile of Sarah Palin, writing about her 2 years as Alaska governor, because at the time, everybody in my world in the Washington press corps expected that Palin was going to run for president in 2012, and she was as exciting to political insiders and to cable TV watchers in that presidential cycle as Donald Trump was in this one. And so I thought I would be industrious and get out ahead of the curve and actually go out to Alaska and kind of write about her tenure there. My thesis was that The only governing record she really had was the 2 years that she'd spent as Alaska governor, and although she had been caricatured on Saturday Night Live by Tina Fey, if you go back and look at what she did, she actually wasn't a bad governor. She balanced the state budget, she raised taxes on oil companies, and so I wrote what was a fairly contrarian profile of Sarah Palin. One day after it was published, I got a call from a film publicist who said, I represent a filmmaker. He's done a big film about Palin. He loved your article. Would you come to a sound studio and meet him? And I thought, why not? And the guy I met the next day was Steve Bannon. And Bannon's movie on Palin was not all that good. But Bannon himself was a striking figure. I mean, in a town where people tend to be very homogenous, Democrats look and sound like Democrats. They come up through the same institutions. They work for the same politicians. Same thing on the Republican side. Steve Bannon was this vivid, disheveled character, brimming with vigor, wearing a military field jacket, who had a very interesting style of politics. At the time, what it was that Bannon was espousing, this kind of hard right populism, was thought of as being a part of the Tea Party movement. And what we thought that meant back then was that these were grassroots activists who were very angry about the deficit and about government spending. But Bannon, even back then, used the term nationalism, which nobody else was using. And he was trying to advocate for this idea of populist nationalism. I didn't write about it at the time because Bannon didn't strike me as somebody who was all that important, but he was colorful, and I am a magazine writer, and so I embedded with him on and off over the next few years, and eventually wrote a cover story in Bloomberg Business Week about him. It was really the seed of Devil's Bargain. But during those 3 or 4 years, an interesting thing happened. The ideas that Bannon was talking about, this grassroots anger toward the establishment, really began to roil the Republican Party. And Bannon, from his perch at Breitbart News, was one of the leaders of this movement. And what was so interesting about the movement was that it was clear that its energy was really directed inward. It was directed at the Republican Party. At the time, this would be about 2013, 2014, it was directed in particular at the Republican House Speaker, John Boehner, who Bannon thought was the embodiment of lily-livered Republican establishmentarianism, someone who was in hock to country club Republicans, who rubbed elbows with lobbyists, who had the concerns of what Bannon called the Dobbs class in mind above the concerns of middle-class Americans, and he set it as his mission to oust John Boehner. And as the years went on, Bannon's politics really had energy and momentum, especially among an emerging group of Republican congressmen who are part of the House Freedom Caucus, the hardest of the hard-right Republicans. And in 2015, they succeeded in their job, or in their task of ousting John Boehner. So I thought that Bannon at that point really was an interesting political figure and started writing about him. I did not anticipate the rise of Donald Trump. I certainly didn't anticipate that he would become president one day. But it did seem clear to me in 2015 the ideas that had so much energy at a congressional level in Republican politics would almost certainly have that kind of energy in the presidential primaries, which were just beginning. Because it was going to be an open seat, because Obama was term limited, just about every Republican with any qualification at all was planning on running for president. And Bannon was adamant that this idea of nationalism was something that he had to inject into the Republican primary process. I remember him saying that, it's great that we knocked off John Boehner, it's great that our ideas are ascendant, but presidential primaries are where parties hash out what it is that they stand for. He thought it was important to get his own candidate in the race. I didn't know this at the time, but he had been working on Jeff Sessions, who was a populist senator from Alabama to run. Sessions ultimately said no. Bannon tried to recruit Lou Dobbs, a very toothy Fox News host who styles himself a populist. He said no. Turns out he had some undocumented immigrants working for him. on his property. But the guy who wound up saying yes eventually was Donald Trump. And part of the story I tell in the book is how Trump and Bannon first came to get together. Most people, I think, didn't know about or think about Steve Bannon until he emerged suddenly in August of 2016 as Trump's third and final campaign manager, and a very controversial figure. But in fact, Bannon had known Trump since 2010 and had been tutoring him or indoctrinating him, if you prefer, with this idea, this hard-right populist nationalism. And so I wanted to talk today a little bit about why it was, I think, that succeeded in a way that nobody saw coming. At the heart of Bannon's vision of nationalism is a kind of political arbitrage. He recognized in an intellectual sense something that Trump later came to recognize in a visceral sense, and that is the priorities of the Republican Party were still rooted in the interests of an earlier generation, but no longer addressed the needs of the party's increasingly elderly, white, downscale rural voters. Republicans, for a generation since Reagan, people like Mitt Romney, people like Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, generally prioritized free trade, tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, a hawkish foreign policy that projected American power abroad, and crucially, they sought to pay for these programs by cutting the entitlement programs that benefited the poorer, elderly, rural voters that were now the heart and soul of the Republican Party. This idea of pushing free trade, of pushing globalism, has been Republican catechism for the 35 years since Ronald Reagan. Bannon recognized, though, that this agenda was vulnerable to a populist attack, and together he and Trump launched one. Most Republican voters today, Bannon recognized, don't benefit from the policies that their leaders are pushing. And that's because, although there is a narrow donor class that's a part of the Republican Party, by and large, rank-and-file voters tend to resemble the Rust Belt types that the media focused on so intently during the presidential campaign. These downscale, blue-collar workers, many of them with a high school education, all of them being buffeted to various degrees by the ravages of the global economy. And not only did these voters not benefit from the Republican agenda, but they were actually being stuck with the tab. And Bannon was an expert at stoking these anxieties and turning the base sentiment against the leaders of its own party in much the same way he'd done with John Boehner. For a generation since Reagan, politicians had prospered by essentially muddying this distinction, the idea that we are going to pursue a set of policies that are the ones desired by our donor base, and we're going to muddy the fact that our rank-and-file voters are the ones who are going to pay for it. And what Bannon and Trump did in the presidential primaries was to highlight this fact. And for my money, Bannon's political genius was to call the standard GOP agenda unpatriotic and un-American, and to dub his own plan pro-American nationalism. It had a kind of visceral appeal that I saw again and again and again when I was out in small towns or out at Trump rallies and listening to what it was that Republican voters wanted from their leaders. Remarkably, Trump was the only one of the 17 major Republican presidential candidates who pursued anything like populism. And as we saw, that was a very effective message. He wiped the slate, these 16 Republican candidates, all of whom were far better credentialed and qualified for the job of being president than Trump was. What is interesting to me, and what's sometimes misunderstood, is that Trump himself got this. He's often portrayed as an empty vessel, or someone whose marionette strings are being pulled by Steve Bannon or other people. But in my conversations with Trump, it was clear that he understood this on a visceral level. I interviewed him in May 2016, just after he'd secured the Republican nomination. Trump, who is not one to keep confidences, told me about a private conversation he just had with Paul Ryan, during which he told Ryan that the Republican agenda was a loser and that he wasn't going to run on it. So I went and pulled the quote from that interview. So this is Trump speaking. I told Paul, there's no way a Republican is going to beat a Democrat when the Republican is saying, we're going to cut your Social Security, and the Democrat is saying, we're going to keep it and give you more. It struck me that this was a shockingly acute observation from somebody who wasn't in the business necessarily of having a lot of acute insight about politics or anything else, but Trump recognized the flaw in his own party's agenda. Republicans were offering a bad deal, and Trump, a consummate deal maker, decided that he would offer a much better one. He told me during this interview that he was going to turn the GOP into, quote, a workers' party, which I thought was funny because it echoed socialist language, and Trump obviously didn't realize that. That's pretty much the pitch that he made in the general election and that won him the presidency, so I guess the joke is on me. By and large, I think Democrats, establishment Republicans, and the press were blind to the seductive power of the nationalist pitch. And I think we missed it for two reasons. The first is that Trump's shocking behavior and the wave of scandals it produced sucked up all the energy in the press. Every day there was some new outrage that we had to chase after that dominated the news. Since Trump seemed ticketed for a certain defeat, it didn't necessarily seem worthwhile to parse and examine the basis of his politics and what it was he was really pushing. The second reason we're blind to nationalism is that there's a social penalty that makes it difficult to have a public discussion about some of the topics that Trump was raising out on the campaign trail. I wanted to read from a few of them because I think this point is still largely missed. In the closing weeks of the campaign and speeches and ads, Trump, with encouragement from Bannon, made a point to attack the global international financial system and to single out, in particular, three bankers, all of whom happen to be Jewish: Janet Yellen, Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, and George Soros. I'm quoting here from a speech that Trump gave a few weeks before the election. Quote, "It's a global power structure that is responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed the working class, stripped our country of its wealth, and put that money into the pockets of a handful of large corporations and political entities. The only thing that can stop this corrupt machine is you." Because of the sinister allusion to bankers and the fact that the bankers that Trump mentioned were all Jewish, the Anti-Defamation League objected, and the coverage of Trump's attacks was viewed through the lens of these were anti-Semitic dog whistles. I went and pulled the coverage, representative article from the Washington Post that gives a flavor of how Trump's speeches were being interpreted by the press and at large by the country. Quote, "Trump's remarks were laced with a kind of global conspiracies and invective common in the writings of the alt-right white nationalist activists who see him as their champion. Some critics also heard echoes of historical anti-Semitic slurs in Trump's allegations that Clinton, quote, meets in secret with international bankers to plot the destruction of U.S. sovereignty. And the media and financial elites were part of the soulless cabal." That was standard in the media coverage of Trump during the last few months of the campaign. The idea that all it was really propagating was conspiracy theorists and anti-Semitism. And no doubt, some people heard it that way and were moved to support Trump as a result of it. The problem with approaching coverage this way, though, I think, is that this outlook didn't allow for the possibility that many voters might be justifiably angry at international banks, at political and media elites for reasons other than their basest prejudices. After all, wages have been stagnant for millions of people. There are large swaths of the country that haven't recovered from the financial crisis. They're now dealing with an opioid epidemic. And, you know, of the hundreds and hundreds of people that I met out on the campaign trail who were Trump supporters, certainly some of them were motivated by racism, by anti-Semitism. I interviewed Richard Spencer and a lot of the white supremacist folks who've been so prominent in the news. But by and large, the people I spoke to didn't seem to be motivated by that. And one of the most interesting and underreported traits of many Trump supporters is that if you ask them who their second choice is, often it wasn't a Republican. It was Bernie Sanders, who, they would tell me, espoused many of the same populist ideas, at least when it came to economics, not immigration and refugees, but on economics. A lot of people found that attractive. If you take Steve Bannon's nationalism as a whole, it really has two major components. There's the anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, Islamophobic component, parts of which have always been a part of Republican politics and that Trump only amplified greatly. And then there's the economic component, the desire to curb Wall Street excesses, to raise taxes on the wealthy, to bring back manufacturing jobs, and to redirect more of the spoils of the capitalist system to the broad middle class. This is the part of Trump's message that I think resonated with people far beyond the ordinary Republican base. The idea that globalism, there's also a trade component to the economics too, the idea that globalism and our balance of trade with China has hollowed out the blue-collar economy and left the U.S. a net loser is something during the campaign that you were as likely to hear at a Bernie Sanders rally as you were at a Donald Trump rally. What interests me most right now about Donald Trump's presidency is that with great encouragement from Steve Bannon, he eagerly took on the anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim component of Bannon's nationalism. And you saw this in the Muslim travel ban, the aggressive crackdown on illegal immigrants, the ongoing push to build a border wall, and even Trump's support of Senate legislation, a bill called the RAISE Act, that would reduce legal immigration. So he's not going after only illegal, but also legal immigration. But to Bannon's great frustration, and I think ultimately this will be the frustration of Trump's blue-collar supporters, Trump has mostly forsaken the economic component of the nationalist program that he laid out on the campaign trail. Looking back, it's clear to me that Trump never had any allegiance to these ideas to begin with, and we can see this because he spent a large part of the campaign railing against bankers in Wall Street, Goldman Sachs bankers in particular. And as soon as he was elected president, he stocked the upper levels of his administration with bankers, many of them from Goldman Sachs. He's also pushed a tax cut that overwhelmingly favors the rich at the expense of the middle class, and in fact would actually raise taxes on some middle class families. This is one of the ongoing conversations I had with Bannon while he was in the White House, was to try and point up the disparity between what he had said and what Trump had run on, and what Bannon and Trump were actually achieving, or at least advocating for in the White House. And true economic nationalism was never really a proponent of it. Bannon, to his credit, I think was more faithful to these ideas than Trump was, because while he was in the White House, he actually did argue that Republicans ought to raise marginal tax rates on high-end earners, which is an absolute heresy for any Republican to say since George H.W. Bush lost re-election after raising taxes in 1992. And it's probably no coincidence that Bannon exited the White House shortly afterward. I think Bannon's departure from the White House marks the next chapter in the story of nationalism in the U.S. Because Bannon has made clear to me and to other people that he's going to continue pushing the ideas that Trump ran on. After insistently staying behind the scenes during the Trump campaign and in the White House, and cultivating this image of himself as a shadowy Rasputin figure who never appeared on TV and never gave speeches or appeared in public, Bannon has emerged as a public figure now with the express intent of leading this nationalist movement himself. Bannon's a smart guy who understands Trump's Trump's fragile psychology better than just about anybody else I know. So he's been very careful to couch his movement building as something he's doing on behalf of Trump. But it's really not that at all. Bannon is attempting to take nationalism beyond Trump. And he's trying to recruit a full slate of candidates who will run against Republican incumbents with the explicit idea of overthrowing the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, in the same way that Bannon and Breitbart and the congressional allies were able to oust John Boehner 2 years ago. To me, this sets up a fascinating political experiment because we're about to find out if nationalism is a movement that other politicians can take up and carry forward, or if it really only exists as a component of Trump's cult of personality. I have learned the hard way that it doesn't pay to make predictions in U.S. politics, so I'm not going to make any predictions about where nationalism is going. But I do think that there's a third option, and I'll end my talk on this note. I think it's entirely possible that the future of nationalism, at least economic nationalism, lies not with Republicans but with Democrats. During his time in the White House, Bannon became increasingly frustrated by his inability to advance economic nationalist ideas. And it wasn't only that he thinks this is an important component of right-wing nationalism. He was worried that if Republicans didn't implement his ideas, they would be left for Democrats to take up, and that these ideas were powerful, and that if the right Democrat took them up, they would beat Trump and the Republicans. If you look at how politics in both parties has shifted over the last 2 or 3 years, the prospect of a democratic nationalism strikes me as a live possibility. The last major party figures before Trump came on the scene were Mitt Romney, the Republican nominee in 2012, and Hillary Clinton, of course, the Democratic nominee last time around. Both of them are what Steve Bannon would describe as globalists. They're free traders. They're very friendly with big Wall Street banks. And yet it's impossible to imagine today that any presidential nominee in either party with that profile would ever be nominated going forward. Trump, I think, showed the folly of trying to run a free trading candidate in a Republican primary. There were 16 of them, they all lost. I think Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and Trump too to an extent, in his defeat of Hillary Clinton in the general election, demonstrated the weakness of globalism and free trade on the Democratic side. And in fact, Bernie Sanders, who no one took seriously and had been a gadfly his entire career, nearly prevailed over Hillary Clinton and might have, had the circumstances been a little bit different and the rules not tilted quite so heavily to Clinton's side. And it's clear, if you spend any time at all in Democratic politics these days, that all the energy is on the left-wing populist side of the party. While Democrats have rightly been accused, I think, of an excessive focus on identity politics, what's interesting to me is that their economic ideas, ideas and values that are broadly shared across the party, fit comfortably under the rubric of an American first economic nationalism. If you think about what Democrats stand for and how it helps the country, they're advocating a stronger safety net, real middle-class tax cuts, stronger entitlement programs, including an expansion of Medicaid, and perhaps even a single-payer Medicare for all style health plan. It doesn't seem too difficult for me, for a talented Democratic politician, to say, look, this is nationalism, we're helping the whole country, not just the narrow part of it that Trump appeals to. What it will take to realize this as a Democratic politician who can take up this message and frame it in a way that unifies not only the Clinton and the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, but also attracts some of the voters who supported Trump because they liked not his anti-immigrant rhetoric or not his anti-Muslim rhetoric, but his economic populism, and still want to see it realized. So with that, I will stop and I will take questions from anybody who has about the book, about Steve Bannon, about Donald Trump, and about anything else I can answer for you that has to do with Washington politics. Thank you. Oh, I think we have
Okay, I'm going to ask that people ask their questions into the microphone so that we can pick it up on the recording. So we'll be running the aisles with microphones and handing them out.
And because we have so many people and there's never quite enough time, I'd love to hear your political speech after the talk, but please get right to the point with the questions so that as many people as possible get a chance to ask them.
I'm curious your reaction to the state of journalism in this country today. Corporate media. continuous cable news, people such as Morning Joe, and what is the role of people such as Chris Hedges and Democracy America, some of those?
Broad question. I do think that in the campaign, cable news in particular helped give rise to Donald Trump because cable TV in particular has a weakness for spectacle. And if there was one thing that Donald Trump reliably provided, it was spectacle. Not only did Trump provide spectacle, but he did it in a way that occasioned lots of debate, which is the other thing that cable news enjoys. There's been a lot of criticism of the mainstream press for their coverage of both Trump and Hillary Clinton. I'm probably in the minority that thinks the press did a pretty good job, that it isn't the press's fault that Hillary Clinton isn't president. And it's difficult to cover a figure like Trump, who none of us have ever experienced before. There's never been anyone like him in journalism. But I am encouraged by the strength of the investigative journalism, in particular at the big papers, that we've seen since Trump became president. I actually think that a lot of the investigative journalism done during the campaign was very strong. And my argument is nobody went into Election Day voting for Donald Trump thinking he was a nice guy. Everybody had seen that he promised to give money to charity, and he never actually did. He said horrible things about women. We documented them all. You all saw the Access Hollywood tape, which I think gave the truest sense of what Trump is really like as a person. So I felt like the media more or less did their job in saying, look, this is who this man is. It's up to voters to decide whether or not they want him to be president. But I think that the reporting on the White House has been exceptionally strong in the 9 months of Trump's presidency, partly because journalists recognize that Trump is an abnormal president and what he is doing is different than any president before. And I think the coverage has reflected that. And also because so many people in the White House recognize this too. And so the press has become a vital sounding board for people in government, and even a tool to help them control Trump. You saw the leaks from James Comey, for instance, that helped bring about the special counsel. That is a good example of how people in government have used the press to steer news coverage in a direction that had a result that, at least in theory, will help to contain Trump's more dangerous excesses. And as far as Democracy Now! And some of the smaller independent shops, I think they're wonderful. There's a bounty of material for media to investigate in the Trump administration. Mainstream media, the Washington Post, New York Times, as wonderful as they are, can't get to all of it. And I think that people like Chris Hayes and Amy Goodman do a wonderful job, particularly of highlighting stories that are difficult to cover on cable news because they don't have the kind of spectacle that a Donald Trump tweet does.
I think an example of the abandonment of economic nationalism is the health care proposals that would hurt many of the very people that supported Trump. My question is about Obama, for whom I voted twice. In terms of defending his legacy, I can understand, though I disagreed with his not campaigning so strongly for Hillary, neither he nor Sanders, I think, did what they could have. But now that Trump has been president this time, what are your thoughts as to why he doesn't more vigorously speak out on behalf of the Affordable Care Act, which was
why Obama doesn't speak?
Why Obama isn't more vigorous in speaking out? He's seen how Trump functions. It's now 9 months in, and so I don't understand why he's not. Yeah, it's one thing to campaign for these couple senators and so forth, but why not the ACA?
It's a great question, and I think it's a really good point that what awakened the masses and many of the Trump voters to the fact that perhaps he did not have their economic interests in mind was a health care bill written by Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, the very style of Republican that Trump had campaigned against and oddly took up their agenda, which is one of my hobby horses that I mentioned in the book. I think what woke them up to the idea that Trump didn't have their economic interests in mind was that once the prospect of repeal became real and the media began to cover exactly who would be hurt and what they would lose, those voters recognized, oh, wait a minute, Trump isn't helping us here, he's hurting us. So I think that's one of the reasons why I think there's an opening for Democratic nationalism. As far as why Obama didn't campaign more vigorously for Hillary and why he didn't come out and vigorously defend the health care law, it's really the same reason. After 8 years, people who love Obama, but one of the things that held back the health care bill and made it unpopular throughout his presidency is the fact that it was known as Obamacare. And it's very difficult to get blue-collar, white, working-class people who don't like Barack Obama to support his health care bill if it's called Obamacare. And in states like Kentucky that had a Democratic governor, they specifically branded it Connect, they call it, K-Y-N-E-C, so that people wouldn't think of it as Obamacare. And when pollsters go out and measure the popularity of Kentucky's healthcare system, it's very high. And when they ask those same respondents, well, how do you feel about Obamacare, it's very low. So I think one of the reasons that that Obama fell back and didn't defend it was precisely because the law needs to exist beyond Barack Obama. And in talking to Democrats who are involved with the pushback against repeal, this was also, there is a need in democratic politics to be able to organize at the grassroots level. There's a danger in relying too heavily upon one big figure like Obama to kind of do everything for you. One of the things that has most encouraged the democratic strategists and activists that I talk to is that not just once or twice, but 3 or 4 or 5 times, there were several attempts by Republicans to pass various forms of repeal, and all of them failed specifically because angry voters, including some Trump supporters, showed up at town hall meetings and said, "You're not going to take away my health care." So I think it's good in that case that Obama didn't lead that fight, because I think there are a lot of good reasons why he shouldn't.
Would you say something about the influence of the Koch brothers on Donald Trump?
I would be happy to.
You talked about Bannon pulling him in one direction. What's the difference between the direction that the Koch brothers are pulling?
So the question about the Koch brothers, the extraordinarily wealthy, hard-right libertarian donors who I think have put more money into national politics over the last 5 years than any other family. I don't know that the Koch brothers have been particularly influential with Donald Trump or in the Trump administration because they stand for a more hard-right libertarian kind of populism. I talked earlier about Republican leaders pushing a set of ideas, free trade, low taxes, tax cuts for the rich. These are ideas that the Koch brothers very much support, and they support politicians who support them. But if you remember, Trump in the campaign ran against those ideas, and the Koch brothers, who have spent years building what amounts to their own political party, trying to run candidates, were so disgusted by Trump's win and the inability of their politicians to emerge as the Republican nominee that they didn't participate in the presidential race. And so because they criticized Trump, because they didn't give Trump money, Trump didn't feel that he owed them much. Now, one of the great benefactors of Koch brothers' largesse is Vice President Mike Pence. So it's not as though their ideas aren't heard. And because Trump and Bannon have been so ineffective in implementing nationalist politics, there is an opening for their ideas to have influence. But I think by far the more important mysterious right-wing billionaire is Robert Mercer and his daughter Rebecca, who are the main benefactors of Steve Bannon and Donald Trump. And in fact, I devote a chapter in Devil's Bargain to talking about Mercer and how it was that he funded this effort both to tear down Hillary Clinton and to build up Trump and Bannon. And I talked also just now today about Bannon's effort to kind of lead what amounts to a splinter movement of nationalist Republicans within the Republican Party. That is, as I understand it, largely being financed by Robert Mercer and his daughter. So I think the book to be written, although I'm not volunteering for it, is a book on the Mercers and their effect on politics. I think they're the more important billionaires going forward.
Excuse me, you talked earlier about the Trump fan or the Trump base, the Trump voter, and profiled them as high school graduates and from the Rust Belt, et cetera. What astounded me was that in addition, we talked about some anti-Semitism and racism. What astounded me the most was, in spite of all those videos of Trump behaving badly with women, that I really thought that would tip them over, because these people are family people, they have daughters, whatever. And I guess I would say, do we add misogynistic to this profile of these people?
It's a great question, and it's really, I think, a mystery to a lot of us in the press. I don't have I can give you my impression of what the answer is. Why didn't Trump's misogyny? Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, why is it that this blue-collar, working-class base continued to support Donald Trump even after the Access Hollywood tape and all of the outrageous things that Trump said and did, which pretty clearly marked him as unfit for the presidency? These are by and large family people. Sort of, what's wrong with them? It's hard to answer. I spent a lot of time with the interview, and I don't think that there's any one answer. But by and large, the common thread that I heard from all of them was an absolute disgust with Washington, and not with Obama necessarily or Hillary necessarily, although she was very unpopular, but with politicians generally and politicians in both parties. What I heard often was despair and a belief that U.S. government is so broken and so corrupt that it's going to take someone absolutely outrageous and unbeholden to any of the interests in Washington to shake things up and fix the government. Of course, here you have this guy who clearly is not beholden to anyone, willing to do or say anything. I think there was a real belief, I think it's turned out to be the wrong one, but I think there's a real belief that, look, we don't necessarily admire this guy, but we think if we send him to Washington, he is going to clean things up and make hell, for all those lobbyists and bureaucrats and all these people who have been busy lining their own pockets and ignoring the likes of me and my family and my community. And that's the best guess that I have. And then, the other answer, part of the reporting I did in this book was to try and get an inside view of what it looked like to the people running the campaign, the Trump campaign. And they leaked me a lot of data, a lot of polling stuff. The other component here, I think, is that there really was disgust after that Access Hollywood tape. And you saw in the polling, not only did a lot of Republican politicians distance themselves from Trump, but a lot of the voters that were supporting him at the time, especially swing voters, moved away from him also. What happened, though, is that over the next 3 weeks, there were two events. One, Bannon rolled out all these Hillary Clinton accusers to try and muddy the Access Hollywood story and say, hey, look, don't just focus on Donald Trump. Look at these poor women who have been, allegedly assaulted by Bill Clinton, who Hillary has tarnished their reputation. She's just terrible. And the combination of Republican antipathy toward the Clintons, I think, started to bring voters back. But what really did, especially with swing voters, was James Comey's decision to reopen Hillary Clinton's email investigation about a week before the election. And if you look at the internal poll numbers, voters after the Access Hollywood tape came back to Trump kind of two ways. The first was after the second debate. And just before the second debate, Bannon had held this surprise news conference with Trump, flanked by these accusers, and the whole thrust of that debate was Trump leveling these charges that Clinton had enabled sexual violence. After that, Republican voters started to come back, and within 3 weeks, even some of the Republican politicians who bailed on Trump put their tail between their legs and came back to him. Jason Chaffetz, Republican congressman from Utah, who was always the quickest to a TV camera, was the one that stands out in my mind. Went on TV and piously said that he had a daughter, that he could never support Donald Trump. That was on August 7th when the Access Hollywood tape came out. And by October 26th, he had been browbeaten into saying publicly that he was going to vote for Donald Trump. So the Republicans came back then, and a lot of the independent voters, the voters who were on the fence, came back after the James Comey letter came out. And there were a group of them in particular. I don't want to belabor these things for too long, but one of the things I got in the book, that the Trump folks, as data scientists, there were a universe of people who essentially couldn't decide between Trump and Hillary, and the Trump data folks dubbed them double haters, because these voters didn't like either candidate, and yet history showed that they tended to turn out at the polls. What you see in Trump's polling data after the Comey tapes is that the double haters broke to Donald Trump. And the Trump folks believe that because the Comey letter gave them permission to support Donald Trump. He may not be an admirable person, we may not really like him, but look at what Hillary's done, the FBI is investigating. That's absolutely horrible. He's got my vote. I think those two things tilted it, and that's why you wind up with President Trump.
Josh, if you are able to sleep soundly at night with Donald Trump in the White House, I'd like to know why. And if you are awake because he's in the White House, I'd like to know what your biggest worries are.
Well, no reporter is able to sleep soundly during Trump's presidency because Trump doesn't allow reporters to sleep. He often tweets at around midnight. Much to my annoyance, he gets up at 5:30 in the morning to watch Fox and Friends, and that often occasions an angry tweet storm. So my joke with my colleagues is that Trump is going to wipe out the press corps by just denying us sleep. We're all going to drop dead before year 4. You know, my job isn't really to sleep soundly, even leaving the Trump tweets aside. It's to cover the story and explain it as best I can. So I try and keep my own political beliefs out of it. But certainly there are a lot of people that I cover, not just Democrats, but Republicans, who feel that Trump is a real danger to the country, and take solace in the fact that, at least for now, there are a group of widely admired by both parties generals, both John Kelly, the Chief of Staff, James Mattis, the Defense Secretary, H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, who they hope will steer Trump away from his most dangerous impulses and, if necessary, intervene before something too dangerous or untoward happens. But on the one hand, they can't keep him away from Twitter, and that's started some international crises. And on the other hand, nobody really knows what would happen if Trump decided, tomorrow, after a segment on Fox and Friends or whatever, that he wanted to launch missiles against North Korea. I mean, I think that's an issue of ongoing concern for a lot of people in high levels of government. I'm calling you, but I don't know.
Hello. A recent trend that I've noticed is that when predominantly conservative speakers visit liberal college campuses, there is often a violent or at least a protest-based response to these speakers. I was curious, and just a recent example of this is Ben Shapiro visited UC Berkeley, and they had to spend over $600,000 just on security from their own students, the concern of them attacking the speaker. So I was curious, from a journalistic perspective, how you feel about the perceived danger of these conservative speakers visiting college campuses, and do you feel that the importance of the possibility of violence in response to the speaker is outweighed by the importance of perhaps intellectual and maybe philosophical diversity with regard to political thought on campus?
It's a great question. I come down very strongly on the side of diversity, and I think what these conservative speakers have figured out, I mean, let's be clear, a lot of these people aren't really there to advocate political ideas. They're entertainers, they're provocateurs, they're trying to cause a political reaction. And students and in some cases, faculty in a lot of schools are distressingly willing to play along. I think the way to deal with speakers like that is to ignore them. But they certainly get a lot of clicks and a lot of excitement and often get book deals by showing up and intentionally provoking people in places and on campus where they know they can reliably incite a response and then can turn around and sort of continue their shtick by saying, oh, look, these terrible liberals are all hypocrites. So,
hello.
Can we get somebody, you want to just shout? You've been raising your hand for so long, I'll just repeat your question.
Along the lines of the general keeping Trump contained, what are your thoughts on Congress in general not really taking a stand?
Great question, yeah.
Some of the things that he does.
Yeah.
When he blatantly lies, they seem to
look the other way, yes. So, yeah, let me repeat your question so everybody can hear. So the question basically was, I talked a little bit about the generals who are in place as a kind of stopgap if Trump goes too far. The question was, why haven't Republicans in Congress been more willing to step up and criticize him or try and stop him after some of his more crazy or outrageous behaviors? Well, the reason Democrats don't do it is because Democrats don't control either house of Congress. Republicans do, and I think ought to be investigating a lot of the conflicts and scandals that we see emerging from the White House. The political problem that Republicans have is that Trump, while he's very unpopular among the country at large, remains quite popular with Republican voters, and in particular, people who voted for him. And in most cases, is more popular than the Republican member of Congress. So the fear that Republican politicians have, and I've spoken to a bunch of them, is that if they were to go out publicly and criticize Trump, his voters, who are also their voters, would side with Trump and not with them, and they would lose their seat for re-election. And the best example of this is Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, a longtime conservative, a little more moderate than most Republicans, wrote a book this spring called The Conscience of a Conservative. It was a brutal indictment of Donald Trump. Somebody did a poll about a week or two after the book came out. Flake's approval rating in Arizona was at 17%. He is considered, I think, the most vulnerable Republican incumbent this cycle. So that is sort of an object lesson in, or at least Republicans think it is, and why you don't go out and confront Donald Trump. Now, I think if Democrats win back the House or the Senate, all of that will change very quickly, because then they'll have the power of Congress, subpoena power, the Government Oversight Committee, all sorts of investigators, and can begin to look into, can begin to investigate the Trump administration in much the same way that Democrats did Ronald Reagan in the 1980s when they controlled power. But as long as Republicans control all the levers of power in the government, there really isn't much Democrats can do besides complain publicly, which most of them have been quite willing to do.
Hello, thanks for coming. You mentioned that Bannon and Trump failed to implement their nationalist agenda after they won the election, but then it kind of fell apart. What is your opinion on the fact that there's a great instability in the White House with all the following parts position changes and Bannon out of the administration, officially? Is this a reflection of the entire outsider/nationalist movement, or is it specifically because of Trump's personality? And would you say that, can we separate Bannon and Trump just because Trump is a special personality?
Great question. I think, the great question of Trump's presidency is how is it that a guy who had such powerful ideas and was able to sweep aside all these Republican politicians and break every rule of politics that we thought existed and still get like the president, seems absolutely hapless as a president. Once he got in the White House, everything went wrong. I think there are a couple of reasons for this. I think the first reason is that Trump as a candidate ran as a nationalist. When Steve Bannon ran his campaign, it was Bannon's ideas that were the ones that Trump talked about, and there weren't competing centers of power. Everybody was on the same page. The problem is that once Trump got into the White House, he began to bring in many of the very people he criticized. Goldman Sachs bankers like Gary Cohn and Stephen Mnuchin, and even some of the allies that Bannon had in the campaign, people like Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, who have been perfectly willing to push a nationalist line when Trump was a candidate, got into office and decided, well, you know, that was all just for show. These guys are rubes. You know, we're going to try and steer Trump in a more moderate direction because, you know, it's just saying you're going to do these things is a little different than actually doing them. And a lot of people in the White House really don't want to deport 11 million undocumented immigrants and send kids, you know, who came to this country as children illegally back to a country they've never seen and don't know. And so all of a sudden, beginning in the transition, you had a power struggle. There were competing ideas. I think the other factor is the personalities. Bannon is someone with very sharp elbows, a volcanic temper, very much like Trump. He holds vendettas. He goes after his enemies. It often seemed like he was more interested in waging fights against his colleagues in the administration than he was in passing laws. And then, of course, there's the problem of Trump himself and what he actually stands for, if anything. Trump is a fascinating politician. If you went to his stadium rallies, you know, most of the coverage of those rallies on cable news tended to focus on the protesters getting beat up and this or that. But if you're actually at the rallies, what was most interesting was to watch Trump and what he did. And it was unlike any politician I've seen. He would get out there for 90 minutes or 2 hours, and he would talk to the crowd, and he would kind of throw out lines and see how they reacted. And over the course of the campaign, you could see him trying out different ideas, and when they worked, incorporating them into his politics. The best example of this, and I tell this in the book, is the wall. Trump had been turned on to the power of illegal immigration as a political idea, mostly by Steve Bannon in 2013, 2014. But Trump had a young staffer named Sam Nunberg who was frustrated by Trump's inability or unwillingness to keep focused on this anti-immigrant message. And so Nunberg came up with this mnemonic device. He said, tell them you're going to build a wall to keep out immigrants, thinking that that was something easy for Trump to remember. Trump wasn't too into the idea at first. It took 3 or 4 months to get him to try it out, but he tried it out at a conservative conference in Iowa, and the whole place erupted, and Trump saw that this was working, and so he kept talking about it. And later on in the campaign, he began to add embellishments. I'm going to make a wall, and nobody builds like Trump. I'm going to make a wall, and Mexico's going to pay for it. And you could see him kind of developing these ideas. They were very effective as political messaging. I think the problem was Trump never had any real allegiance to these ideas. I mean, Trump didn't think about it in terms of policies that would have to get enacted, what their costs might be, how we might put together a coalition, whether or not people would really want this done. What he liked about it was that he could see that it was an effective tool and that people were responding to it. Well, it's a lot harder to pass a law and build a wall because, to pass legislation because it entails doing more than holding a stadium rally. And Trump is somebody who doesn't seem particularly interested or maybe able to build a legislative coalition that would enable him to do that. And what we've seen repeatedly is that he'll say he wants something one day, and even in the afternoon, he'll switch to the other position. There are countless examples of it. The most recent yesterday being the bipartisan health care fix, or Alexander Murray bill to prop up Obamacare. In the morning, Alexander Murray announced they had a deal. Trump was very receptive to it, spoke positively at a White House news conference, and within 3 or 4 hours managed to flip-flop and criticize it. in turn against it. So the real recipe for chaos, it seems to me, is having a president who has no idea what it is he wants to do or how to do it, and shifts his allegiances depending on what he thinks will look good on cable news or maintain his popularity with his base. I think all those things together really explain why the administration has been such a mess and hasn't been able to accomplish much. A couple more?
Yo, over here. In an organizational sense, what do the Democrats need to do to prevail in next year's congressional elections, and then in 2020 against President Pence?
Ooh, there's a loaded question. The thing that Democrats need to do to prevail next year is to turn out the kind of Democratic voters who vote in presidential elections but don't vote in midterm elections. Those tend to be millennials, all you con students, will need to get out and vote. African American turnout fell considerably once Barack Obama wasn't on the ticket. They'll need to come out and vote. Latino voters, I think, will need to come out and vote. And they'll need to do so in numbers and across the country, especially in non-urban areas, and especially in Republican-leaning districts, in order to knock off enough Republicans for Democrats to take control of the House. In 2020, I think what Democrats need to do is to find a candidate who can unify the party and who can, I'm a big believer in this idea of Democratic nationalism, and speak about democratic politics in a more populist, economic, almost class-based sense. So having watched Hillary Clinton try and fail to win the hearts and minds of most Democratic voters, I think that whoever that person is going to have to come from the left wing of the party and move to the center. Because Clinton, who was a politician from the center of the Democratic Party, did everything she could to move to the left, move even beyond where Barack Obama was in a lot of positions, and yet never was embraced and was actively scorned by the left wing of the Democratic Party. So I think that the next Democratic nominee, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or somebody like that, is going to have to be somebody who can unify liberals while also working with the party establishment and ideally from a Democratic standpoint, be able to win back a lot of these white, blue-collar voters who used to vote Democratic but were seduced to an extent by Trump. They need to find a message that brings them back into the Democratic fold.
Hi. You talked a lot about why Trump won and why Hillary lost, and none of your reasons included what happened with Russia and how we've learned over time that the Bernie supporters, through their Facebook page, were being fed stuff untrue about Hillary Clinton, and that on YouTube, that got into our Facebook feeds, African-American young men who we found out have been paid by the Kremlin, spewing anti-Hillary, that she was anti-black and a racist person. And so I feel like it's unfair to not mention those things that we know have happened, and
No, it's a good question, Russia and their effect on the election. I think one of the reasons I didn't mention it, it certainly does deserve to be mentioned, is because it's difficult to quantify exactly what effect all of that had. There's no way that I know of for journalists to measure that, and we're not even clear how broad this Russia Facebook campaign was. Bob Mueller, the special counsel, this is one of the things he's going to investigate. And I think partly as a result of his investigation and ongoing investigations in Congress, the big tech companies like Facebook and Twitter are coming under pressure to reveal more about what they know. Or this isn't information that I can't call up Facebook and say, tell me how many Russian trolls you had buying ads and who they went to. So we depend on government investigators and to an extent public pressure on the companies themselves to yield this kind of information, which by and large they are unwilling to do. I think the fact that there has been this upswell in public pressure in a kind of astonished horror at the extent of this Russian influence campaign means we're probably likely to get answers, but I don't think anybody can say with any certainty that that had a decisive effect on the election. It had an effect, but I don't know exactly what it was. And it's really difficult, to disaggregate the effect of Russian Facebook posts, from James Comey's letter, from people who are just don't like Hillary. It's hard to pinpoint what it is that cost her the election, but certainly that was one component.
Right, we've got time for one more question, but before we get to that, I just want to remind you that we've got a reception set up for after the talk. The easiest way to get to that reception is going to be to come down through these ground level doors and go out around towards the back of the auditorium. We've got cookies and coffee set up, and Bank Square Books is here selling copies of Devil's Bargain, which I believe Josh will sign.
I'd be happy to sign.
Okay, so one more question.
Hi. I'm very interested in your opinion of how the DNC exactly tipped the scales towards Hillary Clinton during the whole primary process.
Sure. I'm not I think Clinton was, within the Democratic Party establishment, Clinton was viewed fairly early on as the preferred choice to be Democratic nominee. And President Obama had signaled to Joe Biden that, look, my allegiance is going to be with her. The Clintons were, to a lesser extent, remain a real force within the Democratic Party. They had allies in the Democratic National Committee. And so if you are a famous, well-known politician like Hillary Clinton, who has the support of the incumbent president, even if it's only tacit, and who is basically liked by rank-and-file Democratic voters, the only real threat to you winning the nomination is that some insurgent candidate will prove to be more enticing and more exciting. And so the way you limit that is by limiting the chance for candidates like that to get national exposure. Well, the greatest place to get national exposure is in debates. Those are the galvanizing moments where everybody tunes in to see who's going to attack who. That was clearly how Trump made his way to the Republican nomination. And what the DNC did, the chairwoman was an inveterate Clinton loyalist, was they limited the number of debates. I think there were only 4 or 5. And 2 of those, if I'm not mistaken, were on Saturday nights, went up against major college football games. It was at the time of week where people would be least likely to turn in and watch. And so I think the playing field was tilted, not just against Bernie Sanders, but against Martin O'Malley, anybody else who didn't have Clinton's political ties and name recognition and could have emerged. And I think that's one reason why Sanders supporters were justifiably angry at how he was treated and limited in the Democratic primary process. So with that, I want to say thank you all so much for coming.